A millionaire on the verge of a huge deal sees his life turn upside down. A simple cleaning lady tries to warn him about a plan that could destroy everything he's built. But behind her hides a secret, and a vengeance that could change everything. Caught in a web of betrayal, conspiracy, and deadly danger, only the truth can save them. Before you dive into this inspiring story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable tales. The sun was setting over New York City's skyscrapers when Richard Montgomery walked through the mirrored doors of the building that housed the headquarters of Montgomery Enterprises. At 45, he commanded an empire valued in billions, built with the determination and strategic vision he had inherited from his father. His footsteps echoed across the polished marble of the hall as he headed to his private elevator, discreetly greeting the employees who still remained in the building at that hour. On the 50th floor, his executive assistant, Marianne Sanders, awaited him with a tense expression. "Mr. Montgomery, Dr. Paul Andrews requests your immediate presence in the meeting room." Richard adjusted his navy blue tie and followed the corridor. Paul, his partner for 15 years, rarely made urgent requests at this hour. The meeting room was immersed in twilight's penumbra when Richard entered. Paul, a man with graying hair and an impeccable suit, was hunched over a stack of documents. "Richard, we need to finalize the last details of the deal with the Chinese. Tomorrow's meeting cannot have any flaws." The deal in question was the largest in Montgomery Enterprises history. A billion-dollar merger with the Asian conglomerate Jiang Corporation, which would open the doors of the Eastern market to the American company. Richard spent the next 2 hours reviewing contracts and spreadsheets with Paul, who displayed an unusual interest in certain contractual details. "These clauses about asset transfers seem a bit complex," observed Richard, frowning as he examined a specific page. Paul quickly offered elaborate explanations about necessary legal protections in international negotiations, but something in his tone awakened a slight uneasiness in Richard. While the two executives discussed the deal's particulars, a silent figure observed the scene through the frosted glass of the door. Helen Davis, recently hired for the cleaning team, paused her work upon hearing raised voices coming from the meeting room. Normally she wouldn't pay attention to executives' conversations, but something in the urgency of the whispers made her hesitate. "Paul, are you absolutely sure these clauses are necessary?" Richard's voice sounded concerned. "It seems like we're ceding more control than initially agreed upon." "Trust me, Richard." Paul's reply came quickly and firmly. "These clauses are essential to ensure the Chinese cooperation. Without them, we risk losing the entire deal." Helen discreetly approached, pretending to clean the railing near the door. The word she caught next made her heart race. "And when the shares are transferred to the offshore holding, we'll have total control without raising suspicions." Paul's voice was almost a whisper, but Helen managed to distinguish every word. "I don't know, Paul, this doesn't seem ethical to me." The hesitation in Richard's voice was palpable. "Ethical? We're talking about business, Richard. If we want to survive in the global market, we need to play by their rules." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. This didn't seem to be just a complicated negotiation. It sounded like something much darker. Meanwhile, inside the room, Richard stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. New York's lights were beginning to dot the urban landscape, reflecting the brilliance and complexity of the business dealings unfolding in the heights. "Paul, we built this company based on solid principles. My father always said that integrity was our most valuable asset." Richard turned to face his partner. "I cannot simply ignore this." Paul stood up, approaching Richard with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father built an impressive empire, it's true. But times have changed, my friend. If we don't adapt, we'll be swallowed by the competition." Outside, Helen felt the weight of the information she had just heard. She wasn't a simple cleaner. Her past held secrets that made her particularly sensitive to conversations like that one. But revealing her true identity now would be too risky. Richard, still hesitant, picked up the documents again. "I'll analyze this more carefully tonight. Tomorrow, before the meeting with the Chinese, we'll talk again." Paul nodded, but Helen noticed a glimmer of concern in his eyes. "Of course, Richard. But remember, this might be our only chance to make the leap we've always dreamed of. When the two men left the room, Helen quickly moved away, resuming her cleaning tasks with apparent normalcy. But her mind was far away, processing what she had heard and considering her options. Richard headed to his office, his mind filled with doubts. As he passed by Helen, he barely noticed her presence, lost in thoughts about the company's future and the decisions he would have to make. Helen, in turn, observed the businessman walking away, knowing the next 24 hours would be crucial. She had a choice to make: maintain her disguise and ignore what she had heard, or risk everything to prevent what seemed to be a fraud in progress. As the elevator took Richard to the ground floor, Helen made her decision. She couldn't stand idle while another corporate empire was destroyed by greed and corruption. With determination in her eyes, she put away her cleaning materials and prepared for a long night of investigation. Night fell over New York City, and in the corridors of Montgomery Enterprises, the games of power and betrayal were just beginning. Richard Montgomery, unknowingly, was about to face the greatest challenge of his life, and his salvation would come from the most unlikely person, a cleaner with a mysterious past and a secret mission. Dawn was already advancing when Helen Davis, still dressed in her cleaner's uniform, slid silently through the empty corridors of Montgomery Enterprises. The building, so vibrant during the day, now seemed like a sleeping giant, with only a few security lights breaking the darkness. With agile and precise steps, Helen headed to Paul Andrews' office. Years of training as a private investigator had prepared her for moments like this. Her hands, protected by thin gloves, worked skillfully on the lock. In seconds, the door opened without a sound. Paul's office was a study in corporate ostentation, noble wood furniture, modern art on the walls, and a stunning view of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Helen ignored all this, focusing on her objective, finding evidence of the conspiracy she had heard earlier. She started with Paul's computer, using advanced hacking techniques to bypass security. As the files opened before her, Helen felt her heart accelerate. Documents, emails, and spreadsheets revealed an elaborate scheme not only to take control of Montgomery Enterprises, but also to use the merger with Zhang Corporation as a facade for a global money laundering operation. "My God," murmured Helen. Eyes widened before the screen. "This is much bigger than I imagined." While copying the incriminating files to a portable device, Helen heard a noise in the corridor. She froze, senses on maximum alert. Footsteps were approaching. With quick and silent movements, she turned off the computer and hid behind a heavy curtain, barely breathing. The door opened and Paul Andrews entered, followed by a man Helen didn't recognize. "Are you sure it's safe to talk here?" asked the stranger with a strong foreign accent. Paul laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Relax, Zhang. At this hour, only the rats are awake in this building." Helen held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she feared being heard. "And what about Montgomery?" questioned Zhang. "Does he suspect anything?" "Richard?" Paul snorted with disdain. "He still believes in fairy tales about integrity in business. By the time he realizes what's happening, it will be too late. Tomorrow, after signing the contract, Montgomery Enterprises will be ours." The two men continued discussing details of the plan, unaware of Helen's presence. She recorded every word in her trained memory, knowing each detail could be crucial. "And the others?" asked Zhang. "The competitors who mysteriously disappeared in recent months." Paul smiled, a predatory gesture that made Helen shudder in her hiding place. "Let's just say they decided to retire early, permanently." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, revealing a web of corruption and manipulation that extended far beyond Montgomery Enterprises. When they finally left, Helen waited long minutes before daring to leave her hiding place. With slightly trembling hands, she finished copying the files and left the office, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. Her disguise as a cleaner now seemed ironic. She had in fact exposed the dirt hidden in the most obscure corners of the company. Meanwhile, in his luxurious penthouse on the other side of the city, Richard Montgomery spent the night wide awake, reviewing the deal documents. Something didn't fit, but he couldn't identify exactly what. Years of trust in Paul made him hesitate to suspect his longtime partner. Looking out the window, at the city that never slept, Richard felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Montgomery Enterprises wasn't just a business, it was his father's legacy, the livelihood of thousands of families. Every decision he made affected real lives. Back at the company building, Helen was preparing to leave when an idea hit her. She couldn't simply leave with the information she had. She needed to alert Richard before it was too late. With renewed determination, Helen headed to Richard's office. Using her skills, she left a sealed envelope on his desk, containing a summary of the evidence she had found and an urgent warning about the imminent betrayal. When day finally dawned over New York City, the stage was set for a battle no one expected. Richard Montgomery would arrive at work in a few hours, not knowing that his life and his company were about to change forever. Paul Andrews and his conspirators were preparing to make the final move, confident in their imminent victory. And Helen Davis, the unlikely heroine disguised as a cleaner, watched from afar, knowing that the next few hours would determine everyone's fate. The corporate chess game was underway, and every move could mean the difference between triumph and ruin. As the sun rose over New York City's skyscrapers, illuminating the windows of Montgomery Enterprises, a question hung in the air. Who would emerge victorious in this deadly dance of power, greed, and betrayal? The day dawned in New York City with an electric energy in the air. Richard Montgomery arrived early at Montgomery Enterprises, his impeccable suit contrasting with the dark circles that betrayed a night of poor sleep. Upon entering his office, his eyes immediately caught the mysterious envelope on his desk. With a racing heart, Richard opened the envelope and began to read its contents. His hands trembled increasingly as he absorbed the shocking information. Detailed evidence of Paul's betrayal, money laundering schemes, contract manipulation. Everything was there, exposed in black and white. "It can't be," he murmured, his voice choked with disbelief and growing anger. Meanwhile, in the company's corridors, Helen Davis performed her routine cleaning tasks, her disguise perfectly maintained. Her eyes, however, were attentive to every movement, especially when she saw Paul Andrews arrive, exuding confidence. The tension in the air was palpable as the hour of the decisive meeting approached. Executives from Jang Corporation began to arrive, being led to the main conference room. Richard, still stunned by the revelations, struggled to maintain his composure. Paul found Richard in the corridor, smiling broadly. "Ready to make history?" "My friend?" Richard forced a smile, his stomach churning. "More than you can imagine, Paul." The conference room was full, the buzz of conversations ceasing when Richard took his place at the head of the table. Paul sat beside him, with the Jang Corporation representatives distributed around. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice firm despite the internal turmoil, "before we proceed with signing the agreement, there are some issues we need to discuss." Paul shot a look of surprise at Richard, a shadow of concern crossing his face. Richard continued, his voice gaining strength. "In the last hours, some troubling information has come to my attention. Information that casts doubt on the integrity of this deal and, more importantly, the trust I placed in certain individuals." The silence in the room was deafening. The Jang Corporation executives exchanged nervous glances, while Paul visibly paled. "Richard, what are you doing?" Paul whispered, trying to maintain control. Ignoring his partner, Richard proceeded. "I have evidence of an elaborate scheme, not only to take control of Montgomery Enterprises, but also to use this merger as a facade for illicit operations." Richard's accusations fell like bombs in the room. Raised voices began to rise. Chinese executives demanding explanations, Paul desperately trying to regain control of the situation. It was at this moment of chaos that the doors of the conference room abruptly opened. To the shock of all present, FBI agents entered, led by a suited man who identified himself as Special Agent Robert Mendez. "Gentlemen, please remain in your seats," announced the agent. "We have a search and seizure warrant, as well as arrest orders for some of those present." Panic set in the room. Paul tried to escape but was quickly detained by two agents. Jang Corporation executives shouted in Mandarin, some trying to erase data on their tablets and phones. Amid the chaos, Helen Davis observed everything from a corner of the room where she had discreetly retreated. Her heart was beating strongly, but a small smile of satisfaction played on her lips. Her mission was almost complete. Richard, still stunned by the events, was approached by Agent Mendez. "Mr. Montgomery, we'll need your full cooperation in the investigation. You are not under suspicion, but your company was used in a scheme much larger than we imagined." While Paul was being led away in handcuffs, casting hateful glances at Richard, the businessman felt a touch on his arm. Turning, he found himself face to face with Helen, who had approached silently. "Mr. Montgomery," she said quietly, "there's much more I need to tell you. But not here, not now." Richard stared at her, confused. You're the cleaner, aren't you? How?" Helen smiled enigmatically. "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Montgomery. Just as your partner wasn't who he claimed to be, I too have my secrets. Can we talk somewhere more private?" While the FBI continued their work, seizing documents and equipment, Richard slowly nodded to Helen. He knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would change his life and the fate of Montgomery Enterprises forever. Outside the building, a crowd of journalists was already gathering, news of the scandal spreading rapidly. The empire Richard had inherited from his father was about to face its greatest crisis, but for the first time that day, he felt a pang of hope. Looking at Helen, Richard realized he had found an unexpected ally. Together, they would have to navigate the turbulent waters ahead, unraveling conspiracies, confronting traitors, and perhaps rebuilding not just a company, but trust in a system that seemed irredeemably corrupted. The morning that had begun with the promise of a historic deal ended with arrests, investigations, and the revelation of a scandal that would shake the American corporate world. And at the center of it all, a businessman and a mysterious cleaner, united by fate and a shared sense of justice, prepared to face the storms that would come. The chaos at Montgomery Enterprises continued to unfold as Richard and Helen discreetly withdrew to a smaller meeting room, away from the curious eyes of the police and stunned employees. As soon as the door closed behind them, silence fell heavily over the environment. Richard stared at Helen, his mind a turbulence of questions. "Who are you, really?" he finally asked, his voice a mixture of gratitude and distrust. Helen took a deep breath before answering. "My real name is Helen Davis, but I'm not a simple cleaner. I'm a private investigator, originally hired to investigate the disappearance of businessmen in the sector in recent months." Richard's eyes widened with the revelation. "So you infiltrated my company?" "Yes," Helen nodded, "but what I discovered here goes far beyond my original mandate. Your partner, Paul Andrews, is at the center of a corruption network that extends through several companies and even government agencies." As Helen detailed her discoveries, Richard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Each revelation was like a blow, shattering the image he had built of his life and his business. "But why help me?" Richard questioned, still trying to process everything. "You could have simply handed your discoveries to the authorities." Helen hesitated for a moment, her eyes softening. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of my father. He was also an honest businessman, destroyed by a similar conspiracy years ago. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." The mention of Helen's father touched something in Richard. He remembered his own father, the values he had instilled, the importance of integrity in business. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. At that moment they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Agent Mendez entered, his face a mask of professional seriousness. "Mr. Montgomery, Miss Davis, we need your cooperation to clarify some points." The following hours were a whirlwind of testimonies, document analysis, and shocking revelations. Richard discovered that Paul's betrayal went far beyond what he could imagine. Montgomery Enterprises had been used as a centerpiece in an international scheme of money laundering and market manipulation. Meanwhile, in the company's corridors, employees watched in astonishment at the parade of police officers and handcuffed executives. Rumors and conspiracy theories spread like wildfire, fueled by uncertainty and fear. At the end of the afternoon, physically and emotionally exhausted, Richard and Helen were finally released by the investigators. Standing on the sidewalk in front of the imposing Montgomery Enterprises building, they observed the frantic coming and going of police cars and press vehicles. "And now?" asked Richard, his voice laden with concern. "How will I explain this to the employees, to the shareholders, to the board?" Helen placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time, Richard. You are not alone in this." At that moment, Helen's cell phone rang. She answered, her face becoming serious as she listened. "I understand. We'll be there," she said before hanging up. "What was it?" Richard asked, noting the change in her expression. "It was my contact at the FBI," Helen explained. "They intercepted an encrypted message. It seems that Paul's international partners aren't happy with how events have unfolded. They plan to clean up any trail that might lead to them." Richard paled. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we're not safe here," Helen replied, looking around cautiously. "We need to go to a safe place immediately. There's much more at stake than just your company, Richard. We're dealing with dangerous people who won't hesitate to eliminate any threat." Without waiting for a response, Helen took Richard by the arm and quickly led him away from the building. As they hurriedly walked through the busy streets of New York City, blending into the crowd, Richard felt he was entering a completely new and dangerous world. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep up with Helen's pace. "To a safe place where we can plan our next move," she replied, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. "From now on, Richard, you need to trust me completely. Your life may depend on it." As the sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows between the skyscrapers, Richard Montgomery, the powerful CEO, found himself reduced to a man on the run, depending on the protection of a woman who until a few hours ago he knew only as a cleaner. Night was falling over New York City, bringing with it the promise of unknown dangers and unimaginable challenges. For Richard and Helen, it was just the beginning of a journey that would test not only their courage and intelligence, but also the strength of the unlikely bond that was forming between them. Night was engulfing New York City when Richard and Helen arrived at an old building on the outskirts of the Liberty District. The place, with its worn facade and dusty windows, seemed the opposite of the luxury to which Richard was accustomed. "Is it here?" he asked hesitantly. Helen nodded, guiding him inside. Sometimes the best hiding place is the one no one would think to look for. They climbed 3 flights of stairs until they reached an apartment on the 3rd floor. Helen unlocked the door, revealing a surprisingly well-equipped interior, contrasting with the building's external appearance. "Welcome to my unofficial office," she said, locking the door behind them. Richard looked around, noticing the monitors, surveillance equipment, and a wall covered with photos and notes. "Impressive," he murmured. Helen went straight to the point. "We have to act fast. Paul's international partners are probably already mobilizing resources to clean up the operation." "What exactly does that mean?" Richard asked, a chill down his spine. "It means they're going to try to eliminate evidence and witnesses," Helen responded, her eyes meeting Richard's. "You are now the weakest link in their chain, an honest CEO who can expose the entire scheme." Richard felt the weight of that reality. My God, what about my employees, my family? "I've already taken precautions," Helen reassured him. "I've contacted trusted agents. Your family is being discreetly protected, and key employees at Montgomery are under surveillance." While Helen worked on her computers, Richard sat down, head in his hands. "How did I let this happen? How did I not notice what Paul was doing?" Helen stopped what she was doing and approached him. "Richard, people like Paul are masters of manipulation. They build trust over years, only to betray it at the right moment. Don't blame yourself." At that moment, one of the monitors emitted an alert. Helen rushed to check. "Damn," she murmured. "What is it?" Richard asked, alarmed. "I just intercepted a communication. They know you escaped police protection. They're scouring the city." Richard paled. "What do we do now?" Helen began typing furiously. "We need to stay one step ahead of them. I have contacts who can help us, but we need to be extremely careful. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Helen alternated between making coded calls and analyzing data on her computers. Richard, feeling powerless, observed, trying to absorb as much information as possible. Around midnight, Helen finally moved away from the monitors. "I have a plan," she announced, "but you won't like it." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "We need to leave New York City," Helen explained. "I have a contact upstate who can shelter us while we work to expose the entire corruption network." "Leave the city? But what about the company, my family?" Richard protested. Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "Richard, I understand your concern, but at this moment, you are more valuable alive and free than dead or captured. We can do more to protect everything you love if we're out of their reach." Richard closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. "All right. What do we need to do?" "First, we need to create a distraction." Helen smiled, a gleam of astuteness in her eyes. "Let's make them think we're still in the city." In the hours that followed, Helen and Richard executed an elaborate plan. Using her contacts and hacking skills, Helen created false trails throughout the city, suggesting Richard's movements at various points in New York City. Meanwhile, disguised and using false documents provided by Helen, they prepared to leave the city in the dead of night. At 4 a.m, an old car with no distinctive features was leaving New York City, taking Richard and Helen upstate. In the back seat, Richard looked out the window, watching the lights of the city he loved so much disappear on the horizon. "Where are we going?" "Exactly?" he asked. Helen, focused on driving, responded, "To a small town in Pennsylvania. My contact has an isolated farm there. It will be the perfect place to regroup and plan our next move." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard felt a mixture of fear and hope. He was leaving behind everything he knew, embarking on an uncertain journey with a woman who was still largely a mystery to him. But as the urban landscape gave way to the green fields of the countryside, Richard realized that this could be his only chance to save not just his company and reputation, but also to do the right thing, exposing a corruption network that threatened much more than just his personal interests. With one last look at the rearview mirror, seeing New York City disappear in the distance, Richard turned to the uncertain future that awaited him. Beside him, Helen drove in silence, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, guiding them to what they both hoped would be a safe haven in the approaching storm. The sun was already high in the sky when Richard and Helen arrived at the small town of Green Valley in rural Pennsylvania. The bucolic landscape, with its verdant hills and clean air, drastically contrasted with the bustle of New York City they had left behind. "Is this it?" asked Richard, observing the quiet streets and simple houses. Helen nodded, guiding the car down a dirt road. "Almost there. The farm is a few miles from town." After 20 more minutes of travel, they arrived at an isolated property. A rustic but well-maintained farmhouse awaited them, surrounded by a sea of coffee plantations and pastures. A middle-aged man with sun-bronzed skin and astute eyes greeted them on the porch. "Helen, my dear, how long it's been?" "Uncle John." Helen hugged him warmly before turning to Richard. "This is Richard Montgomery. Richard, this is John Oliver, my uncle and former FBI agent." Richard shook John's hand, surprised. "Former agent?" John smiled enigmatically. "Let's say I retired to a quieter life, but I still maintain some useful contacts. Come, you must be exhausted." Inside the house, the interior was surprisingly modern, contrasting with the rustic external appearance. John guided them to an office equipped with cutting-edge technology. "Welcome to our temporary headquarters," announced John. "Here we have satellite internet connection, secure communication equipment, and access to databases that most federal agents only dream of having." Richard looked around, impressed. "This is unexpected." Helen smiled. "Uncle John has always been cautious. This farm is more than it appears." In the days that followed, Richard, Helen, and John worked tirelessly. Utilizing the available resources, they began to unravel the complex web of corruption that extended far beyond Montgomery Enterprises. Richard was shocked to discover the extent of Paul's betrayal. The scheme involved not just money laundering, but also stock market manipulation, bribing public officials, and even connections to international criminal organizations. "This is much bigger than we imagined," commented Richard, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Helen nodded somberly. "And that's why they're so desperate to silence us. If this comes to light, it won't be just Paul who will fall. Politicians, businessmen, even judges are involved." John, who was monitoring communications, interrupted. "We have a problem. It seems they've tracked you to Pennsylvania." Richard's blood froze. "How?" "Probably through toll booths and security cameras on the highway," explained John. "They have resources. Don't underestimate them." Helen immediately went into action mode. "We need to prepare. Uncle John, do you still have that underground bunker?" John smiled. "Of course. Let's transfer our equipment there. It will be safer." While they prepared for the possibility of an attack, Richard couldn't help but admire Helen and John's efficiency and calmness. He, who had always considered himself a capable leader, felt like a novice in this world of intrigue and danger. At night, while John was patrolling the property, Richard found Helen on the porch, looking at the stars. "How do you handle all of this?" he asked softly. Helen turned to him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "It hasn't always been easy, but after what happened to my father, I swore I would do everything possible to fight corruption, no matter the cost." Richard felt a wave of admiration and something more, something he couldn't define exactly. "I'm sorry about your father. He would be proud of you." Helen smiled sadly. "Thank you. And you, Richard? How are you handling all of this?" Richard sighed deeply. "It's surreal. A week ago, I was a respected CEO, thinking I had control of everything. Now," he made a vague gesture with his hands. Helen placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch sending an electric current through his body. "You're doing the right thing, Richard. Not everyone would have the courage to face this." Their gazes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The tension between them was palpable, years of solitude and dedication to work, giving way to something new and unexpected. The moment was broken by the sound of a branch breaking in the darkness. Immediately, Helen drew a gun that Richard didn't even know she was carrying. "Inside. Now," she whispered urgently. As they ran to the underground bunker, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the night. The calm had ended. The storm was coming. In the bunker, John was already activating security and communication systems. "They're here," he announced gravely. Richard, Helen, and John looked at each other, the gravity of the situation weighing on them. The refuge had transformed into a besieged fortress, and the battle for truth and justice was about to enter its most dangerous phase. As the sounds of invaders approached, Richard realized there was no turning back. He was fully committed now, not just to the fight against corruption, but to Helen and everything she represented. With renewed determination, he prepared to face whatever came next. John Oliver's underground bunker on the farm was a testament to his well-founded paranoia. Reinforced walls, advanced communication systems, and provisions for weeks created an unlikely fortress beneath the tranquil appearance of the farm. Richard watched, impressed, as Helen and John coordinated their defense with the efficiency of war veterans. Monitors displayed images from security cameras scattered throughout the property, revealing a group of armed men methodically approaching the house. "I counted at least 10, said John, eyes fixed on the screens. "Professionals, judging by how they move." Helen nodded, checking her weapon. "Mercenaries, probably." Paul's partners didn't skimp. Richard felt a chill down his spine. "What do we do now?" "Now," Helen responded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We fight back." John activated a defense system that Richard didn't know existed, Powerful spotlights illuminated the property, momentarily blinding the invaders. Simultaneously, a sound system emitted a recording of police sirens, creating the illusion that reinforcements were arriving. The confusion among the attackers was visible on the monitors. Some retreated, others sought cover. Helen seized the moment to activate an alert to her contacts at the FBI. "This will keep them busy for a while," John commented, "but not for long. They're professionals. They'll soon realize the bluff." Richard, feeling powerless, asked, "How can I help?" Helen handed him a bulletproof vest. "Put this on, and stay close to me. Your safety is our priority." The minutes that followed were tense. The invaders, recovered from the initial surprise, began a methodical sweep of the property. John activated non-lethal traps, tear gas, sound, traps, strobe lights, to confuse and delay the advance. "We need to buy time," Helen explained. "My FBI contacts are on their way, but they'll still take at least an hour to arrive." A rumble above them indicated that the invaders had entered the house. The sound of furniture being knocked over and glass breaking echoed through the bunker's audio system. "They'll find us eventually," John said, his voice tense. Helen nodded. "We have to be ready to fight, if necessary." Richard, feeling adrenaline coursing through his veins, asked, "Do you have a plan B?" "Always," Helen replied, a slight smile on her lips. She approached an apparently solid wall and pressed a sequence of points. To Richard's surprise, the wall opened, revealing a tunnel. "An escape route," John explained. "It leads to an abandoned shed a kilometer from here. There's a car waiting there." The sound of footsteps above them intensified. The invaders were approaching. "It's time to go," Helen said, urgency in her voice. But before they could move, one of the monitors flashed, showing an image that made everyone's blood freeze. Paul Andrews, Richard's ex-partner, was among the invaders, a cruel smile on his face as he held a device that looked like a detonator. "My God," Richard murmured, "he's going to blow up the place." Helen reacted instantly. "Change of plans. Uncle John, you and Richard go through the tunnel. I'll create a distraction." "No," Richard protested. "I won't leave you here." Helen stared at him, her eyes soft but determined. "Richard, you're the key to exposing this entire scheme. You need to survive to tell the truth." Before Richard could argue further, the sound of an explosion above them shook the bunker. Dust fell from the ceiling. "Go!" Helen shouted, pushing Richard toward the tunnel. John grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him. With one last look at Helen, who was already preparing to face the invaders, Richard entered the dark tunnel. As they ran through the underground passage, the muffled sound of gunshots and explosions echoed behind them. Richard felt his heart breaking, leaving Helen behind, but he knew she was right. He needed to survive to expose the truth. After what seemed like an eternity, they emerged. In an abandoned shed, a car was waiting for them as promised. "Where are we going now?" Richard asked as John started the engine. "To the only person who can help us now," John replied, accelerating down the dirt road. "Federal Judge Betty Martinez. She's incorruptible and has the power to protect you and expose the entire scheme." As they moved away from the farm, Richard looked back, his heart heavy. Explosions illuminated the night sky, and he silently prayed for Helen's safety. The battle at the farm might have ended, but the war against corruption was far from over. With renewed determination, Richard prepared for the next chapter of this dangerous journey, vowing not to let Helen's sacrifice be in vain. The sun was rising on the horizon when John and Richard arrived in Philadelphia. The city was slowly waking up, oblivious to the drama unfolding on its streets. John skillfully drove through the still empty avenues, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. "How are we going to find Judge Betty?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse after hours of tense silence. John made an abrupt turn, entering a side street. "I have a secure contact. He'll take us to her." They stopped in front of a modest cafe. A middle-aged man, wearing a simple suit, was waiting for them on the sidewalk. Without saying a word, he got into the car. "Carlos," John greeted. "Thank you for coming." Carlos nodded seriously. "The situation is grave. Judge Betty is waiting for us at a secure location." They drove for another half hour, making several turns to throw off potential pursuers. Finally, they arrived at a discreet house on the outskirts of the city. Judge Betty Martinez received them at the door. She was an imposing woman, with gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to see through the soul. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard a lot about you in the last few hours. Come in, we have much to discuss." Inside the house, Betty led them to a well-equipped office. Richard noticed that, like John's bunker, the place seemed prepared for emergency situations. "First," Betty began, "I want you to know that your evidence has reached me. Helen Davis did an exceptional job in ensuring that the truth would come to light." Hearing Helen's name, Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Is she okay?" Betty hesitated for a moment. "We don't have concrete news yet. But Helen is one of the best. If anyone can survive an attack like that, it's her." Richard nodded, trying to maintain hope. "Now," the judge continued, "let's get to the matter at hand. The evidence you gathered is explosive. We have enough to bring down not just Paul Andrews, but an entire corruption network that extends through various companies and even within the government." In the hours that followed, Richard worked tirelessly with Betty, John, and a team of trusted federal prosecutors. Testimonies were collected, documents analyzed, and legal strategies outlined. "What will we do about Montgomery Enterprises?" Richard asked at one point. Betty looked at him with sympathy. "Unfortunately, the company is deeply involved in the scheme, even if involuntarily. There will be consequences, but your testimony and cooperation will be taken into consideration." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of years of work and his father's legacy on his shoulders. But he knew that doing the right thing was more important than preserving the empire that had inadvertently become part of something so corrupt. As night fell, when everyone was exhausted but determined, Betty's phone rang. She answered, her face serious as she listened. When she hung up, there was a gleam of hope in her eyes. "We have news," she announced. "The FBI managed to arrive at the farm in time. There was an intense confrontation, but—" Richard stood up, his heart racing. "And Helen?" Betty smiled. "She's alive. Wounded, but alive. She's on her way to the hospital now." The wave of relief that swept over Richard was overwhelming. He allowed himself, for the first time in days, a moment of pure joy. "There's more," Betty continued. "Paul Andrews was captured. With him, they seized a significant amount of documents and electronic devices that could be crucial for our investigation." John let out a sigh of relief. "This changes everything." In the days that followed, a massive operation was unleashed. Arrests were made throughout the country, companies were investigated, and the corruption scheme was exposed in all its extent. Richard, protected in a safe house, followed the events on television, feeling a mixture of sadness for the fall of his company and relief for seeing justice being done. A week after the confrontation at the farm, Richard was finally able to visit Helen in the hospital. Seeing her pale but alive, he felt his heart fill with emotions he could barely contain. "You did it," Helen smiled weakly. "Exposed everything." Richard took her hand. "We did it, together." As they talked, sharing the events of the last few weeks, Richard realized that amidst all the chaos and loss, he had found something precious, a greater purpose, and perhaps a new beginning alongside someone who perfectly understood what it meant to fight for the truth. The path ahead would be difficult. There would be trials, testimonies, and the arduous task of rebuilding his life. But looking at Helen, Richard knew he wouldn't be alone on this journey. Outside, America was beginning to process the shocking revelations. A new era of accountability and transparency was announcing itself, and in the hospital room, two people who had risked everything for the truth found in each other, the strength to face whatever the future held. The months that followed the fall of the corruption scheme were an emotional and challenging roller coaster for Richard. The judicial process unfolded, with endless testimonies and a flood of revelations that daily shocked the country. Montgomery Enterprises, once a symbol of business success, was now at the center of one of the biggest financial scandals in American history. Richard, now a key witness and collaborator with justice, divided his time between courtrooms and meetings with lawyers. But in every free moment, he was by Helen's side, who was slowly recovering from her injuries. It was during one of these hospital visits that Helen finally shared her complete story with Richard. "My father wasn't just a businessman," she began, her voice low and laden with emotion. "He was an undercover agent, infiltrated in the corporate world to investigate corruption schemes. When he was about to expose a scheme similar to what we uncovered, he was—" She hesitated, and Richard squeezed her hand in support. "He was silenced," Helen continued. "Officially it was a car accident, but I always knew the truth. That's when I decided to follow in his footsteps, not just to honor his memory, but to continue his work." Richard felt a new wave of admiration for Helen. "Is that why you risked so much for me? For Montgomery?" Helen nodded. "When I realized what was happening at your company, I saw the chance to finally expose the type of scheme that took my father from me. But," she looked directly into Richard's eyes, "I didn't expect to care so much about the owner of the company I was investigating." Richard's heart accelerated with this veiled confession. He leaned in, gently touching Helen's face. "You changed my life, Helen, in every possible way." Meanwhile, outside the hospital, America was undergoing a transformation. The revelations of the Montgomery Andrews case, as it became known, triggered a series of investigations into other companies and government agencies. The population, initially shocked, now demanded real changes in how business and politics were conducted in the country. Judge Betty Martinez became a symbol of the fight against corruption, leading a task force that promised to clean up the system from top to bottom. John, with his experience and contacts, became a valuable consultant for the authorities, helping to unravel the complex corruption networks that extended across various sectors. When Helen finally was discharged from the hospital, Richard surprised her with an unexpected proposal. "I want to use what's left of my fortune to create a foundation," he explained, as they walked through a park. "An organization dedicated to fighting corporate corruption and supporting whistleblowers, and I want you to lead it with me." Helen stopped, looking at Richard with a mixture of surprise and emotion. "Are you sure? This would mean giving up on rebuilding your company, your empire." Richard smiled, taking Helen's hands in his. "My empire, as you call it, was built on quicksand. Now I have the chance to build something truly meaningful, something that can make a difference. And I can't think of anyone better to do this by my side." The kiss that followed was both an answer and a promise. A commitment not just to each other, but to a future of integrity and justice. In the weeks that followed, as the trials continued and the country slowly began to heal, Richard and Helen laid the foundations of their new endeavor. The Integrity Foundation was born with the mission of promoting transparency in business and protecting those brave enough to report corrupt practices. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still resistance, veiled threats, and the challenge of changing a deeply rooted culture of corruption. But together, Richard and Helen felt they could face any obstacle. One afternoon, while working on the details of the foundation, Richard received an unexpected call. It was one of his former employees from Montgomery Enterprises. "Mr. Montgomery," the voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, "there's something you need to know. Something about your father and the origin of the company." Richard exchanged a worried look with Helen. It seemed that the past still held secrets to be revealed, and their journey was far from over. Richard hung up the phone, his face a mask of concern and confusion. Helen, who had observed the change in his expression during the call, approached. "What happened?" she asked softly. Richard took a deep breath before answering. "That was Mark, my former financial director. He said he found some old documents in the company safe, documents about my father and the founding of Montgomery Enterprises." Helen frowned. "What kind of documents?" "He didn't want to go into details over the phone, but he said it's something that could change everything I know about my family's history and the company." Richard ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that Helen already recognized as a sign of his anxiety. "We need to go there," Helen said with determination. "If there are more secrets buried in Montgomery's past, we have to find out." The next morning, Richard and Helen headed to what remained of the Montgomery Enterprises headquarters. The building, once imposing, now seemed a shadow of what it had been, with police officers and federal agents still searching every corner for more evidence. Mark met them in Richard's old office, now practically empty. He seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if fearing being overheard. "Mr. Montgomery, Miss Davis," he greeted, his voice low. "Thank you for coming. What I have to show, well, it's better you see for yourselves." He placed an old yellowed folder on the table. Richard opened it with trembling hands, Helen at his side, both avidly reading the documents. As they absorbed the content, Richard's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. The papers revealed a truth he never could have imagined. Montgomery Enterprises had not been founded from scratch by his father, as he had always believed. In fact, the company was born from the acquisition of several smaller companies, some of which had been forced into bankruptcy through questionable financial maneuvers. "My see." "God," Richard murmured, dropping into a chair. "My father, he wasn't the man I thought he was." Helen placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but her eyes continued examining the documents. "Richard, there's more. Look at this." She pointed to a set of names and dates, among them two. The shock of both was the name of Helen's father, along with the date of his death. "It can't be a coincidence," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly. "My father must have discovered something about these acquisitions. That's why he—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Richard understood the terrible implication. His father could have been involved in her father's death. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with conflicting emotions. Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled from under his feet. Everything he believed in, all the legacy he thought he was protecting, was based on a lie. "What do we do now?" Mark asked, breaking the tense silence. Richard looked at Helen, fearing to see anger or accusation in her eyes. Instead, he found understanding and determination. "We do the right thing," Helen replied, holding Richard's hand. "We take this to Judge Betty. The whole truth needs to come out, no matter how painful it is." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right. I can't condemn current corruption if I'm not willing to face the sins of the past, even if it completely destroys my father's memory." In the days that followed, Richard and Helen worked tirelessly with Judge Betty's team to unravel the entire story. Each revelation was like a knife in Richard's heart, but he remained steadfast, determined to correct the mistakes of the past. The press had a field day with the new revelations. "The Montgomery Empire Built on Sand" was the headline in all newspapers. Richard faced the media storm with dignity, publicly taking responsibility for his father's mistakes and committing to make reparations to the affected families and companies. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of testimonies and meetings, Richard and Helen were sitting on the porch of the safe house where they were staying. "How can you still look at me?" Richard asked softly. "After all we've discovered about what my father did, what he might have done to your father." Helen turned to him, her eyes shining with contained emotion. "Richard, you are not your father. You're doing everything you can to correct the mistakes of the past. That's what matters." She took his hands in hers. "Besides, look at us. Fate united us in a way no one could have predicted. Perhaps it's our chance to correct our father's mistakes, to transform this story of tragedy into something positive." Richard felt a wave of gratitude and love for Helen. Despite everything, she was there by his side, facing the past and the future together. "The Integrity Foundation," he said after a moment of reflection. "We can use it not just to combat future corruption, but also to correct the mistakes of the past. We can create a compensation fund for the victims of old Montgomery's practices." Helen smiled, a gleam of approval in her eyes. "It's a wonderful idea, and we can expand our focus to include investigating old cases of corporate corruption, give voice and justice to those who were silenced in the past." As they discussed the details of their new plan, Richard felt, for the first time in weeks, a spark of hope. The path ahead would still be difficult and painful, but with Helen at his side and a clear purpose in mind, he knew they could make a difference. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a reminder that even after the darkest days, there is always the promise of a new dawn. And for Richard and Helen, this new day brought the promise of redemption, justice, and a future built on the foundations of truth and integrity. The following months were an emotional and challenging roller coaster for Richard and Helen. The Integrity Foundation, born from the ashes of the Montgomery Empire, quickly became a beacon of hope for many and a threat to those who still hid in the shadows of corruption. The work was arduous and often dangerous. As they unearthed old cases of corporate corruption, Richard and Helen found themselves facing not only legal challenges, but also veiled threats from powerful people who preferred that the past remain buried. One afternoon, while working in their modest office, a stark contrast to Richard's old room at Montgomery Enterprises, Helen received a call that would change everything again. "Richard," she called, her face pale after hanging up the phone. "I just spoke with an informant. He says he has concrete evidence about your father's involvement in my father's death." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He knew this possibility had been hanging over them since the first revelations, but having concrete evidence was something completely different. What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen approached, taking his hands in hers. "What we've always done. Seek the truth, no matter how painful it is." The meeting with the informant was arranged for that same night, in a deserted parking lot on the outskirts of the city. Richard and Helen arrived early, the tension palpable between them. When the informant arrived, he revealed himself to be a former security guard from Montgomery Enterprises, someone who had worked directly for Richard's father for years. "I should have spoken a long time ago," the man said, his voice laden with guilt. "But fear kept me silent." He handed them a flash drive and some old documents. "It's all here, recordings, emails, direct orders. Your father—" He looked at Richard with regret. He personally ordered the elimination of Miss Davis's father when it became clear that he was about to expose the scheme. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He looked at Helen, fearing to see hatred in her eyes, but found only deep sadness. In the days that followed, they immersed themselves in the evidence, working silently side by side. Each new revelation was like a knife to Richard's heart, completely deconstructing the image he had of his father. One night, exhausted after hours of analysis, Richard finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Helen, I understand if you can no longer—" She interrupted him, placing a finger on his lips. "Richard, listen to me well. You are not your father. His actions do not define who you are." "But how can you bear to be near me?" he asked, his voice choked. "Knowing what my father did to yours." Helen held his face between her hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Because I love you, Richard, not for your name or for what you had, but for the man you are. For the man who chose to do the right thing, even when it meant losing everything." Helen's words were like a balm to Richard's tormented soul. They embraced, letting tears flow freely, sharing their pain and finding strength in each other. The next morning, they made a joint decision. They would take all the evidence to Judge Betty and the press. The complete truth would be revealed, regardless of the consequences. The bomb that exploded with these revelations shook the country. The story of two business empires, one built on the ruin of the other, of fathers who became mortal enemies and of children who found love and redemption amidst chaos, captured the public's imagination. Richard faced the media storm with a dignity that surprised many. In an emotional press conference, he not only exposed all his father's crimes, but also announced that he was donating all the remaining fortune of the Montgomery family to the Victims' Compensation Fund. "I cannot change the past," he said, with Helen at his side. "But I can do everything in my power to correct the mistakes made and ensure a fairer and more transparent future for all." The Integrity Foundation, now stronger than ever, became a symbol of hope and change. Richard and Helen, united not only by love but by a common purpose, led a silent revolution in the American corporate world. As the sun set over New York City that night, Richard and Helen stood on the balcony of their modest apartment, looking at the city that had changed so much, and that they had helped to change. "Do you think our fathers would be proud?" Richard asked softly. Helen smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "I think they would be surprised, and perhaps, somehow, at peace." The path ahead was still long and full of challenges, but together they had transformed a story of betrayal and revenge into one of redemption and hope. And as the city lights sparkled in the distance, Richard and Helen knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, united by truth and the love they had found amidst chaos. 5 years passed since the revelations that shook the American corporate world. The Integrity Foundation, led by Richard and Helen, had become an unstoppable force in the fight against corruption and the promotion of corporate transparency. On a sunny Saturday morning, Richard woke up early, nervousness palpable in his stomach. Today was the day of the launch of his book, Truth and Redemption, An Empire's Journey to Integrity. Helen was still sleeping peacefully beside him, and he smiled, grateful to have her in his life. While preparing breakfast, Richard reflected on the incredible journey they had traveled. The Integrity Foundation had not only exposed dozens of corruption schemes, but it also helped implement new laws and corporate governance practices that were transforming the country's business landscape. Helen entered the kitchen, wrapped in a robe, her smile illuminating the environment. "Ready for the big day?" Richard nodded, handing her a cup of coffee. "Nervous, but ready. It's still hard to believe everything that happened." "You should be proud," Helen said, kissing him softly. "Your book will help many people understand the importance of integrity in business." Hours later, in a packed auditorium, Richard took the stage for the launch ceremony. Familiar faces stared at him from the audience. Judge Betty, now an internationally respected figure in the fight against corruption, John, who continued to be an invaluable mentor and friend, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the work of the Integrity Foundation. "When I began writing this book," Richard started his speech, "I thought I was telling the story of the fall of an empire. But throughout the process, I realized I was really narrating the birth of something much larger and more important." He paused, his eyes finding Helen's in the front row. "This is a story of redemption, yes, but it's also a story of love. Love for truth, for justice, and above all, for each other. It was love that gave me the strength to face the truth about my father and our company. It was love that showed me we can build something beautiful from the ashes of our mistakes." As Richard spoke, images of their journey passed on a screen behind him. Photos of the old Montgomery enterprises contrasted with images of the Integrity Foundation in action. Faces of people who had been helped, companies that had been transformed, all living testimonies of the impact of their work. "Today, in launching this book, I'm not just sharing my story," Richard continued, his voice laden with emotion. "I'm inviting each of you to join us in this ongoing journey toward a more ethical and transparent business world." After the speech, while signing copies of his book, Richard was approached by a young businessman. "Mr. Montgomery," the young man said hesitantly, "your book, your story, changed my perspective. I was about to accept a questionable deal that could leverage my company, but now I know there's a better way." Richard smiled, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's why we share our story, to show that there's always a choice, always a better path." At night, after the event, Richard and Helen walked hand in hand through the park near home, the same park where years ago they had decided to found Integrity. "You know," Helen said, stopping to look at the stars, "when it all began, I was driven by the desire for justice for my father. I never imagined I would find so much more along the way." Richard hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And I never imagined that by losing everything I would gain what really matters." They stood there in silence, absorbing the peace of the moment. The path they had traveled was difficult, full of pain and challenges, but together They had transformed a story of betrayal and revenge into a testimony of love, redemption, and hope. "What do you think the future holds for us?" Richard asked softly. Helen turned in his arms, smiling. "I don't know, but I know we'll face it together, always." As they returned home, hand in hand and hearts full, Richard and Helen knew their journey was far from over. There was still much work to be done, many battles to be fought in the corporate world. But with love, integrity, and determination as their weapons, they were ready to face any challenge. The glass empire had fallen, but from the ashes something much more precious had been born. A legacy of honesty, a beacon of hope for future generations. And so, under the starry sky of New York City, Richard Montgomery and Helen Davis walked toward the future, no longer prisoners of the past, but architects of a new dawn. Dear listeners, we hope Richard and Helen's journey has touched your hearts and inspired reflections on integrity and ethics in business and in life. To continue exploring inspiring stories like this, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it here by clicking on the link to the left. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and human relationships. Don't miss our upcoming content. We would love to hear your opinions and reflections on Richard and Helen's story. How do you think your own lives or professional decisions might be influenced by a greater pursuit of integrity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, each of us has the power to make a difference, to choose the path of integrity, even when it's difficult. Together we can build a more just and ethical world one step at a time. Until the next story, stay well and continue to be inspired.